Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on diminished responsibility to a criminal law scenario. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at the Sandra and the snake mini scenario and talking about how we would apply the law on diminished responsibility to it using that idea structure. Let's start by reading what our scenario is that we've been given. So the situation's this. Sandra has suffered from serious postnatal depression. One evening when her baby was crying, she strangled her to death. Sandra claims she thought the baby was a snake. And you're being asked here to discuss whether Sandra can plead diminished responsibility. Now, what I should point out here is that if you got this in the exam and it just said something like, discuss Sandra's criminal liability, in that situation, you would have to do a full idea on murder first because she's killed the baby, so it could be murder. So you'd explain and apply the law on murder. And then you would say, Sandra might have the defence of diminished responsibility, and this is where you would do the full idea on diminished responsibility. So I just want to emphasise that diminished responsibility is a partial defence to murder, so it's only available to murder. So you can't just talk about just a defence in the exam, because there must have been a crime in order to plead it, and there must have been a murder for the person to be able to plead diminished responsibility. But obviously for our purposes today, we're just looking at diminished responsibility. It'd be useful if we just had a very quick recap on what the law on diminished responsibility is. Remember, there's a video tutorial just on the law on diminished responsibility, so it might be a good idea to watch that again before you come to look at this tutorial on how to apply the law. But very quick recap. So DR, as we've already said, diminished responsibility is a partial defence to murder. So it reduces what would otherwise be murder to voluntary manslaughter. And that's important because it's reducing what would be mandatory life sentence to a discretionary life sentence. The law on diminished responsibility comes from the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, section 52. And you want to be getting these sections in to be in the high mark bands in the exam. The requirements for proving diminished responsibility are here in purple, and the first thing we have to show is that there was an abnormality of mental functioning caused by a recognised medical condition. So although this is one requirement, requirement 1 from 52.1a, there's actually two parts to it. There's abnormality of mental functioning, so we need to know what that means, caused by a recognised medical condition. Students sometimes, when they're applying the law, just say, oh, she's got depression, that's recognised, she can have DR. But you must, when you're applying the law, say there has to be an abnormality of mental functioning which was caused by that medical condition. So Case of Byrne said that an abnormality of mind is a state of mind so different from the reasonable man that the reasonable man would term it abnormal. Typical recognised medical conditions you're going to come across in scenarios are things like depression, Gittins, battered women syndrome, and sexual psychopathy in Byrne. But that's only the first element. Once you're sure you've got that, you need to then work out, okay, they've got this abnormality of functioning caused by depression, say. Has that substantially impaired the defendant's ability to do one of three things? Remember, they don't have to not be able to do all of them. One of them will do. So understand the nature of their conduct, form a rational judgment, or exercise self-control. And this comes from 52.1b. So you need to remember your section numbers because that's going to lift your answer. So if you recall, not understanding the nature of your conduct is where the person doesn't know what they're physically doing. And the Katie Ruff killing would be a good example of that, where she cut up a human thinking it was a robot. She didn't understand her physical action. It might be that they can't form a rational judgment because of this condition. You could use maybe Sutcliffe as an example there because he was killing prostitutes because he believed God was telling him to. So he clearly wasn't thinking rationally. An example of someone not being able to exercise self-control would be Byrne. That was the sexual psychopath. Psychiatrist said he couldn't control these impulses, they were irresistible to him. So you've got to work out from the scenario which of these can they not do. And then the final requirement, does that provide an explanation for the killing? And that's 52(1)(c). So there has to be a link between this condition that impaired their ability to do one of three things and what they've actually done. And just be aware as well that alcohol, sometimes a person will have a condition and they'll also be drunk. Deichmann says that we've got to ignore any intoxication and just focus on the condition that they have. Now that we've had that quick refresher then, let's turn back to the Sandra scenario we were just looking at. So, just as we do in the exam, we need to highlight any issues here that are relevant to the law that we've just reminded ourselves of. So the situation is telling us that Sandra suffered from serious postnatal depression. So I'm going to highlight that. And that's relevant because that's a recognised medical condition. You could use Gittins there because although this is postnatal depression, it's still a form of clinical depression. One evening when she was crying, she strangled her to death. Okay, so we've got the death. She claimed she thought the baby was a snake. So this is relevant, the fact that she thinks the baby was a snake, because this is telling us what is being substantially impaired. So if we go back very quickly, let me just find the right one to this slide. If you think about this situation, she's got postnatal depression, which is causing her to think her baby is a snake. That means that she's not able to form a rational judgment, and also she doesn't understand the nature of her conduct. It's very similar to the Katie Ruff killing, isn't it? Because if she's strangling a baby thinking it's a snake, she doesn't understand the nature of her conduct. And when you think about that situation, does postnatal depression causing her to think that she's strangling a snake when it's a baby, does that explain the killing? Well, yeah, it does. So on the face of it then, it would seem that Sandra is going to be able to have a defence to murder, because although she has killed her baby, this is a very different situation to a straight out murder. Yeah, so she's deserving of this partial defence because we need to recognise her reduced level of culpability. She's killed a baby, terrible, tragic. However, she's not functioning with a normal way of thinking. So that's why we've got diminished responsibility available. So now we know the answer, she can have the defence. Let's look at how we apply it to a scenario. And as always, we're going to use that idea structure. Before I talk you through this, just to emphasise, I mentioned it at the beginning, that if you are applying diminished responsibility to a scenario, you should have done an idea on murder first, because you can't have diminished responsibility as a defence unless there was first a murder. If the question just says advise on diminished responsibility, fine, just go with that. But that's very unlikely. You're probably going to have to advise on the murder and the diminished responsibility. So as always, we use idea, we identify, we define, we explain, and we apply. So firstly, we would identify Sandra may have a defence of diminished responsibility under section 52 of COJA because the facts show there's a recognised mental condition, and we would say postnatal depression, when she strangles the baby. We then define the three requirements for proving diminished responsibility from section 52(1)(a) to (c). So we would say, firstly, there must be an abnormality of mental functioning caused by a recognised medical condition. Secondly, this must substantially impair their ability to know the nature of their conduct, to form a rational judgment, or to exercise self-control. And thirdly, that must explain the killing. Okay, so you list them, and unfortunately they are quite long, but you list them there. You then explain those three requirements. You've listed them already, but now you need to explain them with cases. So you would explain 52.1a, abnormality of mental functioning by a recognised condition, was first defined in Byrne as a state of mind so different from the ordinary person that the reasonable man would term it abnormal. You'd then say recognised conditions include depression, Gittins, battered women syndrome, Alawalia, etc. So you're using your cases here. And you go through all of those requirements using cases where you can. And then you get onto your application where you apply each of those requirements to your character. So you need to say, what's the abnormality of mental functioning? And I've used colour coding here to try and show you that your explanation in the exam is like a checklist for what you should be applying. So you've explained mental functioning, so you're going to apply mental functioning. You've explained impairing ability, so you're going to apply impairing ability, and so on. So I've used the colour coding so you can see that I'm doing it in the same order in my application. On the next slide, I've done a bullet point answer to the Sandra scenario, so I shall just scroll to that now. And there's quite a lot on the slide, so you might want to pause the video and just have a read of this before you press play again, and I'll then talk you through it. Just ignore the red ones. They're just if we were using a rough mark scheme in class. So you can see here I've labelled my answer with IDEA for idea, and I've also used some colour coding on it to make it stand out for you. So this is bullet points. I should stress that in your answer you'll be writing in full sentences, okay, and outlining some of the things from the cases. Mine's very short just for the purposes of this video. So identify that Sandra might be able to plead DR because she's got postnatal depression. Define the three elements. I've listed them in green. And then you explain those three green elements using the cases, which you can see I've put in purple. And then in my application, I've done blue here for you. So I'm going to go through those three requirements in order in Sandra's case. So Sandra has an abnormality of mental functioning because she thinks her baby is a snake. And you're pointing out the obvious here, but it's abnormal. The reasonable man would say it was abnormal to think a human baby was a snake. This was caused by a recognised condition, post-traumatic stress disorder. Sears and Gittins both tell us depression is a recognised condition. So she's meeting requirement 1 in those points. She's unable to understand the nature of her conduct as shown by thinking her baby is a snake, Katie Ruff killing. If I was writing this in the exam, I would write it out more fully and say she clearly doesn't understand what she's physically doing because she thinks she's strangling a snake when she's actually strangling a baby. And this is similar to the robot situation in Katie Ruff killing. And it's good to compare to cases to say similar facts, because that shows that you're reasoning by analogy and you get good application points for that. Third requirement, it explains the killing because there's a clear link between her thinking the baby is a snake caused by her condition and her actually strangling what she thinks is a snake. So my conclusion would be that Sandra can plead the defence. In the exam, I would write this out more fully and sort of say that this would mean that instead of a mandatory life sentence for murder, this would be voluntary manslaughter carrying a discretionary life sentence. So I hope that's been helpful in how to apply the law on diminished responsibility. I'll also do a video tutorial on how to apply the law on loss of control, and also a video on how to apply both of them in the same scenario, because it's very possible that you'll have to do that in the exam.